So, Jean-Francois, first question today. Did you see the eclipse? Where were you?
I was on the steps of University in Montreal with a lot of students, not very far from my house, with my three girls and my significant other, and so we saw the whole thing.
And were you moved?
Well, I was, you know, I moved? I was moved looking at my young girls looking at that.
Ah.
I was amazed by their amazement.
See, now when I asked you that, I asked you that because when we went downstairs at about 3:25, and it happened at 3:27, I had not been necessarily bought in, right? I was like, oh, great, we're going to have an eclipse. Okay, we're going to see it on TV. But when I was there and actually watching this, I was in awe when I saw, for that minute and a half where the moon covered the sun. It was a very spiritual moment, I think. And that's why I asked you if you were moved by that. But if you were with a whole bunch of people, maybe it's not the same.
People applauded.
Yeah, I
We
get a lot of that.
applauded. Well, I don't know if we applauded the sun or the moon, probably both. There's
Okay.
a very well-known song in French, Le soleil a rendez-vous avec la lune.
I know Quand le soleil dit bonjour. What's that one?
Ah,
Quand
non,
le
le soleil dit
soleil...
bonjour aux montagnes.
Oh,
Non,
Motang, that's the one I know.
le soleil a rendez-vous. He has a meet, a
Mm-hmm.
date with the moon,
Avec
but
la
the
lune.
moon doesn't know, and so they never meet. But today they did.
The things you learn on this show. All right. So that said, let me move on to a couple of stories. Number one, big announcement today from the federal government, one of, I guess, at least 5 or 6 in the past week or so. This time over military spending. Big number, $73 billion, but of course spread out over 20 years. What did you make of this? Anything special?
Well, it's clear that in the last 2 years of a mandate, you're making commitments for the next government. If you're very popular, it means that you mean what you say and you're going to have to deliver. If you're looking at the defeat, it means that you're just shoveling that to the next government's decision and finding the money, because they're showing that we're going to know maybe at budget time what it would mean for the spreading out of deficits in the next 7 years. But basically, it surely is a signal that will be received positively by other NATO members. They will meet in Washington in a few days by saying that he will bring Canada's share of GDP to about 1.8, and that's a bit short of 2%, which is the overall horizon that they have given themselves before the end of the decade. Certainly, he will be seen more positively than he has been in the last few years. Now, people will simply ask, those who are more cognizant of Canadian politics, what does the next Prime Minister think about that? And we'll see what Mr. Poilievre says. Conservatives have always been stalwarts of defense, although they didn't really deliver when they were last in power, but in terms of percentage. But Mr. Poilievre will be hard-pressed to say that he will be less involved in defense than Mr. Trudeau has said today.
So with respect to defense, and this is something, of course, that came up, and it comes up every time there's a change of government. Or, for example, I remember when Pauline Marois brought up the subject of separation when she was premier. And then I think all of a sudden, maybe you disagree with me, I think a lot of people, once they heard about Quebec potentially having its own army and its own currency and its own passport, soured on the notion. So I'm wondering now, from what you've seen in Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon's plan, what happens with the military?
Well, this has been pretty stable. I wrote a book about American-Canadian relations over the Quebec sovereignty issue, and I talked to people at the Pentagon that were following that since the 60s. What would be Quebec's commitment in terms of an independent Quebec? And it's always been taken for granted that Quebec would simply take its share of the Canadian Army and the soldiers that are Quebecers and the infrastructure that is here, and that would be the basis for a Canadian Army, and that this army would be part of NATO and NORAD. And even there was a point in the early 70s when the PQ said that they wouldn't be in NATO and NORAD, and the guy at the Canadian desk at the Pentagon said, "We never believe these people. I mean, that's what they say when they're in a position, and then when they get to power, they come to their senses." And they did come to their senses later on, before coming to power in 1936. But I was very struck by the matter-of-fact view that this guy at the heart of the Pentagon had of what would happen. And so what Plamondon has said recently is simply restate PQ policy of decades.
I wonder, though, to that end, and I'm not sure that you can answer this question, but if the presumption is that simply an independent Quebec would go ahead and, use whatever services and military the Canadian Army would provide, is there not the concern that that might not be the case? That's simply saying, well, of course you separate us so you can have our army as well, might simply say, no, form your own?
So what will you do with the equipment that is in Quebec? You'll dismantle it and move it to Ontario? What about the many thousand Quebecers who are in the army? You will say that they won't. Independence means that you're taking your share of the debt and of the infrastructure. That's how it's done. That's how it's always done. So the infrastructure that is in Quebec stays in Quebec. And if you have more or less debt than the percent of infrastructure, then you adjust with dollar signs. But this is, you would give this issue to any international arbiter, he would always come up with this answer.
Okay. I'm just wondering then at that point, and you're right, obviously the infrastructure's here, there are people here who serve in that military. They would not have the option if Quebec was to become independent as to what their future would want to be or how they would want it to be?
Well, I suppose that if the Canadian government were to offer Quebec citizens who are in the army to stay in the Canadian Army, they can opt to do that because they have freedom of movement. But, we fought for a long time to have Francophone units that are basically in Quebec. And there was a lot of deductive work done to know how many soldiers in Quebec City voted yes at the two referendums because of looking at the writings, and there was a substantial amount.
Okay. Let me move on from that because it's obviously a pretty hypothetical situation. But then again, I'm having Anthony Housefather on in about 5 minutes from now. Of course, he announced at the end of last week, after serious reflection, he has decided to stay on as a federal Liberal. What did you think of that?
Well, he's been given a mandate to try and comfort or strengthen the voice of the Jewish community within the Liberal caucus, and to make sure that anti-Semitism is seen as something to be fought against more decisively. Of course, Erwin Cutler is already the representative for the Prime Minister on anti-Semitism. But basically, what this tells me is that the Liberals wanted him to stay, and they were willing to give him something that he would find of sufficient substance
right.
to decide to stay. And so if they had decided that they didn't want him at all, they wouldn't have offered him anything.
Were you surprised by that announcement or not?
I thought Pierre Poilievre helped considerably by having this meeting with 1,500 people in the Montreal riding. I understand that some came from outside the riding, but it was clearly a signal that they're going to fight for this riding. And if there's one riding in Montreal that could flip to the Conservatives, it's this one. And since the Conservatives have been much more 100% pro-Israel than the Trudeau Liberals have been, clearly they must think they can make some gains. So the best person to defend the Trudeau case in Mont-Royal is Housefather. So basically, that's what has given him, I think, he'll may say otherwise, more value in the eyes of the PMO.
Okay. Jean-François, thank you. Talk to you later in the week.